Okay, so are you ready to dive deep into the minds of marketers? Because today we are tackling consumer behavior.
Ooh,
It
excited.
is fascinating stuff. We're going to be exploring how understanding what makes shoppers tick is really like having a secret weapon in the business world.
You've brought excerpts from Consumer Behavior by Leon Schiffman, kind of
Yeah.
a classic in the field.
Yeah.
And these excerpts, I think, are really going to be interesting to dig into because they talk about how marketers segment consumers, how they try to predict their actions, and then ultimately, of course, how they try to sway those consumer choices.
Yeah, and one of the things that stood out to me was this idea of the marketing concept, which basically boils down to know your customer.
Right.
Like, that's it.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's such a fundamental shift from the old days of, kind of mass marketing where it was just like putting it out there and hoping somebody bought it. Now it's like consumers have so much more power and are bombarded with more information than ever before, especially in this digital age.
Right. And that takes us to another point that I thought was really interesting, which is it's not just about making that sale anymore, is it?
Not at all. No. Think about it this way. Businesses are now playing the long game. So it's not just about getting you to buy something once, but really trying to build that trust and making sure that you're satisfied so you come back for more. Schiffman even calls this, building perceived value, which is basically, that difference between you buying something one time and becoming like a truly loyal customer.
Right, it's that relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, so speaking of which, when you think about a brand that you're truly loyal to, what keeps you coming back for more? Is it the product itself? Is it maybe the customer service? Something else entirely? We want to know what drives your loyalty. Let us know.
Yeah.
So I have to admit, when I saw Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the materials, I was like, oh gosh, am I back in Psychology 101 again? But it is relevant.
It is, yeah. And as Schiffman explains, those basic needs that we all have as humans, from the essential needs just to survive all the way up to that desire for self-actualization, they really are intertwined with how we behave as consumers.
Yeah, and when you start looking for it, you see those needs reflected in advertising everywhere. Like even something as simple as like a bottled water ad that's promising pure refreshment or something. They're not just selling hydration, they're selling this idea of like vitality.
Exactly. Or those luxury car commercials that show people who are having, all these adventures and they're really successful in life. What they're selling is aspiration and status and maybe even a little bit of envy.
Yeah. And speaking of kind of subconscious influence, there's this whole concept of the halo effect.
Yeah.
It's this idea that sometimes we're judging a product based on our overall impression of a brand.
Right. It's so powerful. Think about like brand extensions. So a company that's known for making, incredible coffee.
Right.
They decide to start selling coffee-flavored ice cream.
Well, and chances are we're going to think that ice cream is pretty good, just based on the fact that you associate that brand with quality.
Exactly. Or think about celebrity endorsements. So your favorite athlete endorses a certain sports drink, and suddenly you're more likely to want to try that drink just because in your mind, some of their positive qualities like rub off on that product.
Yeah, it's amazing how easily our perceptions can be influenced sometimes.
I know.
And on that note, how about we unpack this sneaky little tactic called the just noticeable difference?
Oh, yes, the JND. This is where marketers, I think, get a little bit crafty, wouldn't you say? Have you ever noticed how a chocolate bar will like shrink ever so slightly, but the price stays the same?
Or how about those bags of chips these days that seem to be filled with more air than they are with actual chips?
That's the J&D in action. So marketers are carefully kind of tweaking a product's size or quantity, just hoping that we as consumers either won't notice or, won't really care enough to switch brands.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what other subtle changes are we missing out there?
Seriously. All right. Switching gears now, this idea of a techno class really piqued my interest. Is this like a real social structure that's emerging?
It's a fascinating concept that Schiffman talks about in the book, and, I think you can definitely see glimmers of it in today's world. So just as our traditional social classes are based on things like income and education and occupation, this techno class suggests that there's this whole other kind of hierarchy emerging based on your comfort level and familiarity with technology.
So it's like those who are fluent in the digital world,
Yeah.
the early adopters who always have the latest gadget, they hold a certain status in this new order.
In a sense, yes. And I think it's a really interesting new lens through which to view how technology is shaping our social dynamics as well. It makes you wonder, how will this techno class influence marketing even more in the future?
We are back and ready to go even deeper into this world of consumer behavior. It's interesting how marketers are tapping into this whole emerging techno-class thing.
Yeah, it really highlights how intertwined consumer behavior is with the constantly evolving social and cultural landscape. Like Schiffman reminds us, we're not just out here making these decisions in a vacuum, are we? Our families, our social circles, even just like the broader cultural context, all of that plays a role in shaping our choices as consumers.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's like there's this invisible web of connections that are kind of shaping what we buy and why.
Yeah, and think about the concept of the family life cycle that Schiffman dives into as well. Our consumption patterns naturally shift as we move through different life stages, right? I mean, a single 20-something is going to have totally different needs and priorities than, say, a couple who are expecting their first child or empty nesters who are, approaching retirement.
Oh, absolutely. And I know even for me personally, my spending habits have changed so much as like my lifestyle and my priorities have evolved over time.
Right.
Like what I was splurging on a few years ago doesn't even cross my mind now.
Totally. And, marketers are very aware of these shifts, right? They're constantly refining their strategies to target those specific demographics within each of those life cycle stages.
So you're saying they're not putting out like minivan commercials aimed at college students?
Probably not going to be as effective, right?
Right.
Because those ads are really laser focused on like the needs and the desires of parents who care about things like, safety and space and kid-friendly features.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is where marketers go beyond just basic demographics like age and income and dive into, what's called psychographics, which is really about our values and our interests and our lifestyles. It's not just who we are, but what makes us tick.
So it's like they're creating these hyper-specific profiles of us as consumers almost to predict our every want and need.
Kind of, yeah. And while it might sound a little unnerving, I get it. This kind of sophisticated market segmentation allows businesses to create much more targeted and ultimately more effective marketing campaigns because they can tailor their messaging to resonate with our specific interests and aspirations.
I mean, it's fascinating, but it does make you wonder about the potential downsides of all this data collection.
Yeah.
Like, where do we draw the line between, what is effective marketing and what starts to feel like an invasion of privacy?
It's the million-dollar question, and it's something that Schiffman grapples with as well in the book. And I don't think there's an easy answer. It's this delicate balancing act. But it's something I think we should all kind of be mindful of as technology continues to blur those lines more and more.
Absolutely. Okay, so on to another topic that I thought was really interesting, this whole idea of the diffusion of innovations.
Yeah.
I love the idea of how new products and ideas kind of spread through society.
Yeah.
And how we all fall somewhere on the spectrum of, early adopters to those who, really resist change.
Oh, it's so fascinating, isn't it? Schiffman outlines these classic categories of adopters from the innovators, who are the ones who just have to have the latest gadget right, all the way to the laggards who are like, I'm sticking with what I know and what I trust.
And each of these groups requires a different approach when it comes to marketing, right? Like, you're not going to convince somebody who's still rocking a flip phone to buy the latest smartphone with the same message that you're going to use to target a tech enthusiast.
Exactly. You have to really understand the motivations and the concerns of each group. The early adopters are probably going to be drawn to those cutting-edge features and that sense of exclusivity, while the folks who are more hesitant, they might need a little bit more reassurance about practicality and value.
It makes you realize that successful marketing is not a one-size-fits-all approach at all. It's about really tailoring your message to resonate with the values and the desires of your target audience.
Yeah.
Wherever they might fall on that spectrum of, adoption.
Exactly. And again, it all comes back to understanding the psychology of why people buy.
And speaking of psychology, I found Schiffman's discussion about cultural influences on consumer behavior to be so fascinating. I mean, we do live in an increasingly globalized world, and what flies in one culture may totally flop in another.
Totally. Marketers have to be so mindful of those cultural nuances. A message that resonates in one part of the world could be completely misinterpreted or even considered offensive in another. And Schiffman gives a great example about how humor can be very culturally specific.
It really is like learning a whole other language when you think about it. But instead of words, you're trying to master all the subtleties of cultural references and values and sensibilities.
And that's why, cultural sensitivity is not just some nice to have. It's really essential for marketing. You need to meet consumers where they are and respect their values and understand their unique perspectives.
It's a good reminder that effective marketing goes way beyond those catchy slogans or flashy visuals. It really requires empathy and research and a genuine desire to connect with your audience on a deeper level.
Totally. Now, shifting gears a bit, we've talked a lot about the psychological and the social influences on consumers, but Schiffman also delves into the ethical considerations that marketers have to grapple with as well.
Right, because it's not just about selling a product, it's about doing so responsibly right.
Yeah.
So what are some of the ethical dilemmas that he highlights?
Well, one major area he focuses on is the responsibility that marketers have to be truthful and transparent in their advertising and to avoid making deceptive or misleading claims.
Right, consumers need to be able to trust the information that they're getting about a product.
Absolutely. He also talks about the potential negative impacts of advertising, especially when it comes to more vulnerable groups like children.
Right.
So, for example, marketing like unhealthy food choices to young children.
Yeah.
That's an area where marketers need to be especially cautious.
It's about striking that balance between, promoting a product, but also being mindful of the broader societal impact of those messages.
Yeah.
And I do think that consumers are starting to become a lot more discerning these days. They're holding companies accountable for their practices more and more.
Oh, for sure. Companies are realizing that ethical considerations can't be just an afterthought. They are absolutely essential for building that trust with consumers and maintaining a positive brand image.
And it seems like consumers are becoming much more savvy and discerning and really demanding more from the brands that they choose to support.
Consumers are more informed than ever these days, and they are using that knowledge to make more conscious decisions. They're looking beyond just the product itself and considering the values and the practices of the companies that they're supporting.
So it's not just about what you buy, but it's who you're buying it from.
100%. Consumers are aligning their spending with their values. They want to support companies that prioritize sustainability, ethical sourcing, social responsibility, all of that.
I think that's really encouraging to see that consumers are becoming more aware of the power of their choices.
Yeah.
And that they're no longer just passive recipients of these marketing messages, but that they're really actively shaping the marketplace with their demands for, transparency and ethical behavior.
Totally. And it makes it such a fascinating time to be a consumer, don't you think?
Definitely.
But it can also be really overwhelming, right?
Oh, for sure.
Because there's so much information coming at us from all sides that it's hard to cut through the noise and make sense of it all.
And that's where I think Schiffman's insights become so valuable, because by understanding all those forces at play, the psychology, the social influences, the marketing tactics, it helps us become more informed and empowered as consumers.
100%. We can learn to decode those messages and recognize, the subtle cues and make choices that truly align with our values and our priorities.
We're back, and now that we've kind of unpacked all the psychology and the ethics behind consumer behavior, I'm curious to get into the actual nuts and bolts of how marketers craft these persuasive messages that really influence our choices.
Yeah, it's like this constant, back and forth, right? Like marketers are trying to anticipate our moves and appeal to our desires and ultimately, nudge us toward that buy button.
And we as consumers are trying to navigate this whole maze of marketing messages and make choices that align with our needs and our values and our budgets.
Right. And Schiffman actually breaks this communication process down beautifully. He outlines all the key players involved. You've got the source of the message itself, the channel it's delivered through, and of course the receiver.
Yeah, it makes sense when you lay it out like that. You have to consider who's speaking, what they're saying, how they're saying it, and who they're trying to reach.
Exactly. And each one of those elements plays such a key role in whether or not that marketing message is going to resonate or fall flat. Think about those toothpaste commercials where you've got a dentist recommending a specific brand.
Oh, totally. They're tapping into that expertise and that authority of a dental professional. It makes it instantly more credible. We're more likely to trust a message if it's coming from a source that we view as, knowledgeable and trustworthy.
Totally. And let's not forget those celebrity endorsements we were talking about earlier, right? Brands leverage the likability and the aspirational appeal of those celebrities to try to, get us to think differently about their products, hoping that little bit of that star power rubs off.
It's amazing how persuasive those endorsements can be, even when we know it's a marketing tactic. But it's not just about the messenger, right? The message itself has to be persuasive and attention-grabbing and relevant to whoever you're trying to reach.
100%. And marketers have a whole arsenal of strategies for this. Everything from crafting compelling narratives to appealing to our emotions to injecting humor or even a little bit of fear to really get our attention.
It's incredible how creative they can be, but also how strategic they have to be to break through all the noise these days. I mean, Schiffman talks about, this whole idea of the fragmentation of media and how consumers have more choices than ever before in terms of how they consume information.
Yeah.
It's not like the old days where you just watch a few TV channels and you see the same commercials over and over
Oh
again.
my gosh, it's a completely different world now.
Right. Yeah.
We're streaming content online. We're engaging with brands on social media. We're getting targeted with personalized ads on our phone. It's like this constant influx of information.
So how are marketers adapting to this whole fragmented media landscape? Because it seems like a huge challenge to reach the right people with the right message at the right time.
It really is. And I think they're realizing they have to embrace this multi-channel approach, basically casting a wider net to try to meet us wherever we are across all these different platforms. And the messaging itself, I think, is having to become so much more creative and interactive.
So it's not just about those traditional advertising channels anymore.
Not at all. Think like personalized content, interactive formats, even incorporating elements of gamification to try to capture our increasingly, fleeting attention spans.
Yeah, they've got to get us before we swipe to the next thing.
Exactly.
It sounds like marketers really have to be adaptable and innovative to keep pace with just the way that we're consuming information these days. Schiffman also touches on this idea of the complexities of cross-cultural marketing, which I feel like is more relevant than ever in our increasingly globalized world.
Absolutely. What works in one corner of the world might be completely ineffective or even culturally insensitive in another.
Right.
And it's something that brands really have to think critically about as they're trying to expand their reach globally.
So it's not enough to just translate your message. You have to really understand those cultural nuances and adapt your approach to resonate with that specific audience.
Exactly. And, humor is a great example. What might be considered funny in one culture could totally fall flat or even be offensive in another. It's all about, really being culturally fluent and sensitive.
It seems like there's no room for a one-size-fits-all approach in today's global marketplace. So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into this whole world of consumer behavior, what are some of the key takeaways that you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that consumer behavior is so much more nuanced and complex than we often realize. It's not just about, responding to these marketing stimuli or making these perfectly rational decisions. It's really this fascinating interplay of psychology and sociology and culture and individual preferences.
And while, the marketers are out there working hard trying to decode all those factors and influence our choices, we as consumers are not powerless.
We're not.
We have a say.
Exactly. By understanding the forces at play and recognizing the tactics that are being used, we can make more informed and empowered decisions about, where we spend our money.
We can choose whether we buy into the hype or whether we see through it and, align our spending with our values and ultimately demand, more from the companies that we support.
100%. And who knows, maybe we can even have a little fun along the way, right? Armed with this knowledge.
Exactly. Now that you've gotten this little glimpse into the inner workings of consumer behavior, how will this change how you approach your next purchase? Will you be more aware of those messages that you encounter?
It's definitely something to think about as you navigate this world of products and persuasion. Until next time, happy consuming, everyone.